quiet town, 3 women, and a predator who moved like a shadow, entering homes without breaking a lock, leaving rooms that looked almost untouched and vanishing before anyone could even imagine a suspect. As we open this case file together, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like this are never forgotten. Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place postcards pretend still exists. A river bending around the old steel works, clapboard houses with porches the width of a living room, block parties where everyone brought a casserole and someone eventually brought a guitar. By the mid-1980s, the steel mill had slowed, but the town's rhythm held steady. Friday night games at the high school, Saturday shifts at the hardware store, Sunday services followed by crumb cake in the church hall. The diner refilled your cup before you could ask. You knew your neighbor's dogs by name. That illusion cracked in a single evening. Saturday, October 19, 1985. Laura Bennett, 21, a psychology major, spent the morning scribbling flashcards and circling notes in a battered textbook. She left her roommate a sticky note with a smiley face looped into the 9, a small kindness that summed up who Laura was. At the diner, coworkers knew her as the girl who would trade shifts or slip a quarter into the jukebox so your song played for free. That night, Laura didn't show up for work. At first, her manager thought it was a mix-up. By midnight, her roommate Zoe Park came home to a silent apartment. The lamp glowed. 2 mugs dried on the rack. Nothing out of place except the silence. Zoe nudged open Laura's bedroom door. What she found would stay with her for life. Laura on the bed, blanket crumpled at her ankles, her face turned slightly as if listening. No chaos. No struggle loud enough to raise a neighbor. Just a body and the absence of sound. Officers Ellen Rourke and Miguel Santos responded, with Detective Cal Whitaker and Chief Harold Dwyer soon after. The door showed no damage. The window frame slid easily. No forced entry. No weapon. No fingerprints. The medical examiner confirmed strangulation by ligature, the object removed from the scene. Whoever did this had left nothing behind. The Mill Creek Herald headline was blunt. College student found dead in apartment, police seek information. The article noted Laura's volunteer work at the youth center, her savings envelope labeled grad school, and her mother's description, soft-hearted even when it cost her. The first unanswered question settled in. Who did Laura let inside? Fear spreads fast in a town like Mill Creek. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. Parents phoned their daughters with the same reminders. Keep the chain on, don't answer the door alone, call me when you're in. 4 weeks, detectives chased whispers. A blue sedan, a man in a brown jacket, a possible secret boyfriend. None led anywhere. Whitaker buried himself in his notebook. Rourke and Santos walked streets and knocked on doors. Chief Dwyer reassured the press that the case was active, though behind closed doors he admitted the truth. They had almost nothing. Winter arrived. Some dared to hope the violence had passed. February crushed that hope. On Monday, February 3, 1986, Dr. Angela Marino, 27, missed her hospital shift. By 8 a.m., police were at her door. Inside, the scene echoed Laura's. The front door unlocked, no sign of struggle, the bed neatly made except for Angela's still body. She too had been strangled. Whatever tool had taken her life was gone. Detective Rourke was the first to voice it aloud. This isn't random. This is patterned. Santos agreed. Chief Dwyer doubled patrols. Whitaker noted the chilling similarities. No chaos, no trace, just precision. Angela's colleagues stood on the sidewalk outside her house that afternoon, stunned into silence. The town now faced a truth it didn't want to name. There was a predator in Mill Creek. The press gave him one. The Mill Creek Strangler. On August 14, 1987, Claire Whitman, 16, taped a fashion magazine page to her wall before bed. An aspiring designer, a cheerleader, a part-time ice cream stand worker, she was the kind of teenager whose laughter filled rooms. The next morning, her mother found her strangled in her bed. No sign of forced entry. No evidence left behind. Only the brutal reality. The killer had struck again, this time inside a home where parents slept just feet away. Claire's death destroyed the illusion of safety. At the high school, grief counselors gathered students. Friends recalled her sketches tucked into lockers, her knack for making people laugh. The school retired her cheer jacket for the season. Detectives pinned her photo beside Laura's and Angela's in the squad room. 3 victims. 1 pattern. And still no suspect. After Claire, fear was no longer background noise, it was the air itself. Residents walked in pairs. Babysitters were escorted to doors. The diner staff phoned one another after late shifts to confirm safe arrivals. Police logged endless calls. A van parked too long, a stranger at the laundromat, a man who changed his walking route. Most of it was nothing, and that was how the killer stayed invisible, by making everything look ordinary. Inside the precinct, Rourke built detailed timelines. Santos chased tips through diners and bars. Whitaker revisited each crime scene, looking for what he had missed. Chief Dwyer faced angry town halls and nightly calls from city officials. The case board grew crowded with notes and threads, but the lines only connected questions. Then suddenly the killing stopped. By early 1988, no new victims had been found. Relief never came, suspicion did. Had the killer died? Was he still here watching? For detectives, the absence of violence wasn't victory, it was pressure. Pressure from the town, from officials, from the weight of fear that demanded an answer, any answer. And soon, under that pressure, investigators would turn their focus not on the real killer, but on a man who could not defend himself. A man who would be forced to carry the blame for crimes he had not committed. The winter of 1988 should have brought relief. 4 months, Mill Creek had lived under a shadow. 3 women gone in 2 years. 3 bedrooms turned into crime scenes without a single forced lock or broken latch. Now, for the first time since 1985, the calendar had turned and no one new had been found. But absence doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it means waiting. Parents still phoned their daughters with nightly reminders. Store clerks still checked over their shoulders when locking up. In living rooms across town, families kept their televisions low, listening for noises that didn't belong. Silence had become another kind of predator. Detectives felt the shift too. When days passed without new leads, frustration curdled into desperation. For Chief Harold Dwyer, each town hall meeting was a storm. "What are you doing?" demanded one resident. "Are you waiting for another girl to die?" shouted another. His officers heard it in diners, in grocery aisles, even at church services. A town that once trusted was now a town that demanded answers. And under that pressure, the investigation began to change. Detective Cal Whitaker had grown gaunt. His wife said he looked like he carried the board of photographs with him everywhere. The faces of Laura Bennett, Angela Marino, and Claire Whitman. His younger colleagues, officers Rourke and Santos, carried their own exhaustion in quieter ways, but they shared the same relentless question. Who had managed to walk into those homes unseen? When no new victims came, the fear in Mill Creek pivoted. If the killer was silent, maybe he was still here. Maybe he was someone they already knew. This was when a name first surfaced: Daniel Avery. Daniel was 28 years old, a quiet man who lived with his mother on the edge of town. He had held odd jobs, stocking shelves, cleaning school hallways, fixing fences, never keeping one long. Some neighbors said he was slow, others that he was too trusting. He had a habit of smiling at people he passed, even when they didn't smile back. He also had a history that seemed, at least to some, to put him within reach of suspicion. He had once been questioned in a trespassing incident, though no charges were filed. A woman in town had reported him lingering near the laundromat late one evening. On another occasion, he was seen carrying tools near the high school after hours. All harmless enough when looked at separately, but under the lens of fear, each became a piece of a puzzle that looked darker than it was. By February 1988, Daniel Avery wasn't just another resident. To detectives running out of options, he started to look like the answer. On February 12th, officers knocked on Daniel Avery's door. His mother, Ruth, answered. Daniel came to the porch in a plaid shirt, wiping his hands on a rag. They asked him to come down to the station to answer a few questions. He nodded. He always nodded when someone in authority asked something of him. At first, the questions were ordinary. Where was he on the nights of the murders? Did he know Laura Bennett? Had he ever crossed paths with Dr. Marino? Did he recognize Claire Whitman's photograph? Daniel's answers were steady but vague. He couldn't remember dates. He confused names. He said he thought he had been home but wasn't sure. The detectives pressed harder. They told him people had seen him near the college. They told him his name had come up more than once. They told him that if he didn't explain himself, the conclusion would be drawn for him. For hours, Daniel sat in that small, windowless room. He fiddled with the cuff of his shirt. He rubbed his palms against his thighs. His words grew hesitant, then contradictory. At times he said he didn't know the victims. At others, he said he might have seen them around. When the questions turned to what happened in Laura's apartment, Daniel's voice faltered. He said something about dreams he couldn't shake, about things he thought but didn't do. The detectives leaned in. To them it sounded like confession. To Daniel it was confusion, the blurring of suggestion and memory under relentless pressure. By nightfall they had what they needed, a statement scribbled on a form with Daniel's shaky signature at the bottom. Words that didn't make sense but could be read as guilt. The arrest hit the town like lightning. Chief Dwyer stood before reporters, flanked by Whitaker, Rourke, and Santos, and declared that Mill Creek could sleep easier. The Mill Creek Herald ran a headline in bold black: "Strangler caught, local man charged in 3 murders." For some, it was relief. At last there was a face to fear, and that face was behind bars. Parents allowed their children to walk to the corner store again. College students attended night classes without escorts. The whisper that had haunted the town, "What if he's still out there?" was temporarily silenced. But not everyone believed. Some residents knew Daniel Avery personally. They remembered him mowing lawns for neighbors or helping at church fundraisers. They said he wasn't capable of violence, let alone murder. They whispered that he had been pressured, that he didn't even understand the words written in the confession. Still, the machinery of justice had started, and it was not easy to stop. The trial began in the fall of 1988. Prosecutors presented Daniel as a troubled man, prone to wandering, with the opportunity to slip into homes unnoticed. They read his confession aloud, word for word, to a hushed courtroom. Detectives described the crime scenes, the eerie lack of struggle, the deliberate removal of evidence. They admitted there was no physical proof linking Daniel to the murders. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA. But they argued that the confession was proof enough. The defense countered fiercely. They called experts who testified to Daniel's limited mental capacity. They argued that he was interrogated for hours without legal counsel, that his words were led and shaped by suggestion. His lawyer even told the jury, "This is not a confession. It is a man trying to please authority, repeating back the words he was fed." But in 1988, the science of false confessions was little known. Fear of another killing weighed heavier than nuance. The jury listened and the jury believed. After 2 weeks, the verdict was read: guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laura Bennett. The charges in the other 2 cases remained open but were expected to follow. Daniel Avery was sentenced to life in prison. For Mill Creek, the case was closed. Headlines declared justice served. The fear that had gripped the town loosened its hold. People began to live again, though cautiously, like survivors of a storm who still glanced at the sky. But not everyone was convinced. Rourke kept the files on her desk. Santos still visited the crime scenes on occasion, walking the blocks as if listening for a clue that hadn't yet spoken. Even Whitaker, who had been the face of the arrest, carried doubts. Late at night, he'd replay the evidence in his head and find only silence where certainty should be. Because there was one truth no one could escape: the precision of the murders, the invisible entry, the surgical removal of evidence. None of it matched Daniel Avery. Whitaker wrote it once in the margin of his notebook, then crossed it out before anyone else could see. We needed an answer more than we needed the right one. But in 1988, Mill Creek wanted closure. And so Daniel Avery went to prison, while the real killer continued to live in the shadows. Closure. It's a word that towns cling to after violence. A word prosecutors use in press conferences. A word juries believe they deliver. For Mill Creek, closure came in the form of a verdict in 1988. Daniel Avery was guilty of Laura Bennett's murder. The relief was almost immediate. Newspaper columns shifted tone, from fear to reflection. Neighbors who once eyed each other with suspicion began waving again. Porch lights stayed on, but more as habit than necessity. By the early 1990s, people spoke of the Strangler in past tense, the way a town remembers a flood that once washed through and receded. But closure can be deceptive. It can paper over doubts without erasing them. And it can let a truth remain buried for decades. Daniel Avery's conviction gave the appearance of safety, but not everyone slept easier. Some residents, especially those who had known him, whispered their disbelief. Still, their voices were drowned out by the louder relief of a community desperate to move on. The official record said Laura's killer was behind bars, while the cases of Dr. Angela Marino and Claire Whitman remained open but likely connected. That distinction was lost on most residents. People preferred the simpler story: the strangler had been caught. The police department shifted resources back to routine crimes, burglaries, bar fights, the occasional domestic call. For the first time in years, detectives Whitaker, Rourke, and Santos were assigned to cases that didn't involve a killer who slipped through locked doors. The community, though scarred, adapted. Parents returned to sending kids on bikes through side streets. The high school reopened late-night events that had been canceled during the height of fear. By the mid-1990s, the town looked almost normal. Almost. For the families of Laura Bennett, Dr. Angela Marino, and Claire Whitman, time didn't heal. It only rearranged the grief into new shapes. Laura's mother kept her daughter's graduation envelope, the one labeled grad school, with a question mark, taped to the inside of a drawer. She never spent the tip money Laura had saved, though the bills grew brittle with age. Angela's colleagues at the hospital planted a tree in her memory. Each spring, it bloomed near the emergency entrance, a splash of pink against the brick. Nurses passing under it would sometimes stop, touch the bark, and remember the friend who had written notes with cartoon stethoscopes. Claire's parents left her room untouched for years. The fashion sketches she taped to her wall yellowed at the edges. When her mother finally boxed them up, she cried into the cardboard flaps, whispering apologies as though her daughter could still hear. These quiet rituals stood in contrast to the public narrative that Mill Creek had healed. In truth, some wounds simply scarred over without ever truly closing. For Daniel Avery, the years blurred. Prison routines became his reality. Count at dawn, meals on schedule, the clatter of doors, the shuffle of bodies in hallways. He didn't understand how he had ended up there. He repeated to anyone who would listen that he hadn't hurt anyone, that he just said what the police wanted him to say. Most ignored him. Inmates mocked him, calling him strangler, with a mix of fear and disdain. Guards kept their distance, some believing the official story, others simply unwilling to question it. Daniel wrote letters to his mother in looping, uneven handwriting. Ruth Avery answered each one, visiting whenever she could. Her health declined in the late 1990s, but she clung to hope that someday someone would see what she had always believed: her son was innocent. When Ruth passed away in 2002, Daniel was not permitted to attend the funeral. He wept alone in his cell, clutching her last letter, the paper crumpled from his grip. While Daniel served time, the real killer, Mark Benson, lived freely. An electrician by trade, he moved between jobs, fixing wiring in schools, churches, and businesses. He lived alone in a rented house not far from the very neighborhoods where the murders had taken place. To those who hired him, he seemed ordinary, even forgettable. He was punctual, quiet, efficient. He knew how to make himself blend in, just another man with a toolbox, entering and exiting homes and offices without raising suspicion. And then he stopped. Whether it was because he feared advances in forensics, because age cooled his impulses, or because he found other ways to channel his darkness, no one knew. The murders ended. By the early 1990s, Mill Creek was no longer haunted by new crimes, and Benson faded back into anonymity. It was the perfect cover. The town believed its monster was locked away. The real monster walked their streets unnoticed. Detective Cal Whitaker never truly let go. Even as the years passed, even as new officers joined the force and younger detectives rolled their eyes at his ghost cases, he kept the files. In his basement, Whitaker kept a second board, the same faces, the same maps, the same notes written in his precise, square handwriting. His wife called it his obsession. He called it unfinished business. In 1994, he tried once more to reopen the case, writing a memo that questioned the lack of forensic evidence against Daniel Avery. The district attorney's office rejected the request, noting that the jury had delivered a guilty verdict and the public needed finality. Whitaker never forgot that word. Finality. To him, it meant the system was more interested in closure than in truth. He never said it out loud in public, but the thought stayed with him. Daniel Avery didn't fit. The lack of physical evidence, the precision of the crime scenes, the contradiction of the confession, it all gnawed at him. But in the absence of new victims, his doubts were easy for others to dismiss. The jury spoke, the DA reminded him. Sometimes that's enough. For Whitaker it wasn't. By the turn of the millennium, Mill Creek had entered a new chapter. The steelworks that had once defined the town were long gone, replaced by strip malls and housing developments. Younger families moved in, many unaware of the dark history from 2 decades earlier. High schoolers knew the term Mill Creek Strangler, but only as a story their parents warned them about. To some, it was no more real than an urban legend, a ghost story to tell around a campfire. For the original residents, it was easier to let the memory fade. Fear is exhausting when carried too long. So they folded it away, speaking of it only in hushed tones when anniversaries approached. Meanwhile, in a prison 2 hours away, Daniel Avery lived out his days as the forgotten man at the center of it all. By the early 2000s, forensic science was changing. DNA analysis, once in its infancy, had become a powerful tool. Cold cases across the country were being reopened, evidence retested, and long-buried truths uncovered. In 2007, Pennsylvania established a cold case review unit, tasked with revisiting unsolved crimes and testing old evidence with new methods. Among the stacks of dusty files, one name surfaced: the Mill Creek Strangler. Detective Whitaker, now near retirement, heard the news with a jolt. He had carried his doubts for 20 years. Now science might finally speak where witnesses and confessions had failed. When the order came to reopen the evidence boxes, he was the first to volunteer. Inside, sealed in carefully labeled envelopes, lay swabs, slides, and fibers collected from the scenes of Laura, Angela, and Claire. Evidence that had once yielded nothing. Evidence that technology had finally caught up to. Mill Creek didn't know it yet, but the story they thought had ended was about to begin again. In quiet laboratories, under sterile lights, technicians prepared to run DNA profiles. In offices, detectives sharpened pencils and reopened notebooks. Families who had endured decades of grief without answers were about to have their wounds reopened. And somewhere in town, Mark Benson went about his days unaware that science was about to catch the shadow he had once believed untouchable. The past was no longer buried. The truth was stirring. A generation had passed since Laura Bennett, Angela Marino, and Claire Whitman lost their lives. For 20 years, the board in Mill Creek's precinct carried their photos, the string connections yellowing under fluorescent lights. Some detectives had retired, others had transferred, and for many, the Strangler had become a story older cops told rookies as both caution and curse. But in 2008, the case that seemed destined to gather dust was quietly picked up again. Not because of a new witness, not because of a confession, but because science had caught up with what fear and failure had left behind. By the late 2000s, DNA technology had leapt forward. Samples once dismissed as too degraded could now be tested with precision. The Pennsylvania Cold Case Unit, working through a backlog, sent out material from dozens of files. Among them were swabs and trace samples from the Mill Creek Strangler murders. Items sealed and stored since the mid-1980s, carried from one evidence room to the next like unanswered questions in cardboard boxes. When the lab called back, the results were unambiguous. The same male DNA appeared at both Laura Bennett's and Angela Marino's crime scenes. Later, it matched evidence from the Whitman home as well. 3 victims, 1 profile. The work of a single killer. For the first time, the police had something that fear, rumor, and confession had never provided: scientific certainty. Pennsylvania submitted the profile to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. Thousands of profiles ran against it. Hours ticked by, then days. Nothing. The profile belonged to someone not in prison, not convicted, not cataloged. For investigators, it was a revelation and a frustration. The net had caught a fish, but they didn't yet know its name. It was Detective Cal Whitaker who pushed for the next step. He had carried the weight of Mill Creek's murders longer than anyone still wearing a badge. When Daniel Avery was convicted, Whitaker had written his doubts in his notebook margins, tiny boxes around questions he wasn't allowed to ask out loud. Now, with DNA pointing elsewhere, those doubts became vindication. "This isn't Avery," he told the team. It never was. Investigators began narrowing the suspect pool. They cross-referenced old lists: repairmen, delivery drivers, neighbors who lived within walking distance of the victims. The name Mark Benson surfaced again. Back in the 1980s, Benson had been a local electrician. He lived 2 streets away from Angela Marino. He had fixed wiring at Mill Creek College, where Laura studied. He'd done odd jobs near the Whitmans' neighborhood. At the time, his name was written down alongside dozens of others and dismissed for lack of evidence. Now, with DNA in hand, detectives revisited him. They followed Benson discreetly. One morning he stopped at a convenience store for coffee. He finished the cup, tossed it into a public trash can and walked away. Officers retrieved it. The lab compared the saliva on the rim of that styrofoam cup to the DNA from the 1980s crime scenes. It was a perfect match. As we continue this case file together, don't forget to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like this are never forgotten. On June 11, 2008, police surrounded Benson's modest ranch-style house on the edge of town. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as the man they'd seen mow lawns and fix porch lights was led out in handcuffs. The arrest shattered the town's uneasy narrative. For 20 years, Mill Creek had accepted that Daniel Avery was the strangler. Now, the man in cuffs was someone else entirely, a man who had walked among them the whole time. The Mill Creek Herald ran the headline, "DNA links local electrician to strangler killings." The Pennsylvania Tribune followed with, "Wrong man jailed for 20 years. For Daniel Avery, the news came through his lawyer. In September 2008, a motion to vacate his conviction was filed. By January 2009, the court overturned his sentence, acknowledging that his confession had been coerced and that DNA proved he was innocent. He stepped out of prison into the cold January air, blinking like a man emerging from a cave. He had missed his mother's funeral. He had missed half his sister's life. He had missed everything. At a press conference, Daniel said only, "I told them I didn't do it." His voice cracked on the last word. The state offered compensation, but no amount of money could return what had been taken. 2 lost decades, a family shattered, a life derailed. For the victims' families, Benson's arrest was both relief and reopened grief. Laura Bennett's brother stood on his porch, holding a photo of his sister with a stack of flashcards in her hand. "We thought this day would never come," he said. Angela Marino's mother, frail now, placed flowers at the tree planted outside the hospital in her daughter's memory. "It's not closure," she told a reporter. "It's just truth. And truth is better than lies." Claire Whitman's parents attended Benson's arraignment. Janet Whitman clutched the cheerleading jacket her daughter had left on the back of a chair the night before she died. Paul Whitman said, "We lived in fear, then we lived in doubt, and now we live with the reality. But at least reality has a name." For Whitaker, the arrest was both victory and burden. He had spent his career chasing the ghost of the strangler. Now the ghost had a face, an address, and a history of walking past the very precinct that hunted him. Colleagues said Whitaker stood a little taller that week. But when asked for comment, he shook his head. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about 3 women who should have lived long enough to see this day." Mark Benson was charged with 3 counts of murder. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. In pretrial hearings, Benson's defense tried to argue contamination, sloppy evidence handling, anything to cast doubt. But the DNA was solid, unshakable. As the trial approached, Mill Creek braced for testimony that would drag the community back through memories it had tried for 2 decades to bury. The difference this time was that the evidence pointed true. For 20 years, Mill Creek had lived with rumors and shadows. Now, in 2009, those shadows were called into the light. The trial of Mark Benson, the man unmasked as the Mill Creek Strangler, drew not just a town but an entire state into the courtroom. Reporters descended from Philadelphia and New York. Network news trucks lined the streets. The courthouse steps became a stage for nightly updates. And inside, 12 jurors carried the burden of deciding justice for 3 women whose voices had been stolen a generation earlier. On January 12, 2009, Judge Howard Franklin presided over the first day of Commonwealth versus Benson. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims, relatives of Daniel Avery, retired officers who had carried the case when it was new, and townspeople who still remembered padlocking their doors after dark in the late 1980s. Benson entered wearing a gray suit provided by his defense team, his expression impassive. He looked like anyone's neighbor, and that was precisely what unsettled the gallery most. For years, people had imagined a monster. Instead, the accused was an ordinary man who had mowed his lawn and fixed wiring at the college down the street. Prosecutor Elaine Porter, sharp-voiced and relentless, stood before the jury. She began simply. 3 women, 3 homes, 3 lives stolen. The same signature, the same violence, the same absence of forced entry. And now, 20 years later, the same DNA. This case is about truth delayed but not denied. Defense attorney Martin Keene, gray-haired and deliberate, countered with restraint. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution will tell you that DNA is infallible. But DNA is only as reliable as the chain of custody that protects it. These samples were collected in the 1980s, stored for decades, handled by countless hands. Can we trust that nothing was lost, contaminated, or misinterpreted? The lines were drawn. Certainty versus doubt, science versus suspicion. Over weeks of testimony, the prosecution presented their case with methodical precision. Forensic experts took the stand first. They explained how samples once too small to analyze had now yielded clear profiles. The jurors leaned forward as slides displayed bar graphs of peaks and valleys, abstract to most, but devastating in their clarity. The DNA recovered from the Bennett, Marino, and Whitman homes matches one man, the lead analyst testified. And that man is Mark Benson. On cross-examination, Keene pressed hard. Isn't it true that evidence sat in storage for over 20 years? Yes. And during that time, evidence rooms were moved, personnel changed, protocols updated? Yes. Isn't it possible contamination occurred? The analyst shook his head firmly. No. The profiles were clear, consistent, and matched Benson's voluntarily discarded sample with 1 in quadrillion certainty. The jury scribbled notes. Detectives followed, walking jurors through the investigation's history. Detective Cal Whitaker testified, his voice steady but carrying the weight of decades. I never believed Daniel Avery was guilty, he said, eyes fixed on Benson. The crime scenes were too precise. The confession didn't fit. But we didn't have the science then. We do now. The most powerful testimony came not from experts but from those who had lived with loss. Laura Bennett's brother spoke of her dreams of graduate school, of sticky notes she left with smiley faces, of a life frozen in 1985. Angela Marino's mother, now in her 80s, walked slowly to the stand with a folded handkerchief. She told the jury, "My daughter saved lives every day at the hospital. She should have had the chance to live her own." And then, perhaps most moving of all, Daniel Avery testified. The courtroom fell silent as the man wrongfully convicted for Benson's crime stepped into the witness box. He described his coerced confession. Hours of questioning without a lawyer, detectives telling him he must have blacked out, that he'd feel better if he admitted it. I told them I didn't do it, Avery said, his voice breaking. But they wouldn't hear me. They wanted it solved and I was the easiest answer. He looked directly at the jury. I spent 20 years in a cell for something this man did. He pointed, unflinching, at Benson. Even the defense did not challenge him harshly. To cross-examine Avery too aggressively risked alienating the jury. Keene asked 2 perfunctory questions and let him step down, the silence that followed louder than any argument. Benson's attorneys tried to create cracks. They brought in an expert witness to suggest that long-term evidence storage could compromise results. They floated the idea that Benson's DNA might have been present through innocent contact, work at the college, visits to neighborhoods. But the explanations faltered against the weight of 3 murders. Are we to believe, Prosecutor Porter asked in closing, that Mark Benson's DNA coincidentally appeared in the private bedrooms of 3 women, all of whom were found strangled? That defies reason. That defies truth. The defense called Benson's former co-workers, who described him as quiet, reliable, unremarkable. But under questioning one admitted, yeah, he could be odd sometimes. He kept to himself. Another recalled he'd once grown agitated when asked about his personal life. Benson himself chose not to testify. He sat motionless, jaw tight, while the case unraveled around him. After 6 weeks of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. Porter urged the jury to remember the women. They trusted their homes to keep them safe. He betrayed that trust. Do not let time be his defense. Keene pleaded for doubt. The state wants you to believe DNA answers every question. But justice is about certainty, and you cannot be certain when evidence has been boxed for decades. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Reporters camped outside, their breath visible in the winter air. Residents gathered at the diner where Laura once worked, watching news tickers scroll across TV screens. On February 27, 2009, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder in the case of Laura Bennett, we find the defendant guilty. A sob broke in the gallery. On the charge of first-degree murder in the case of Dr. Angela Marino, we find the defendant guilty. Angela's mother clutched her handkerchief. On the charge of first-degree murder in the case of Claire Whitman, we find the defendant guilty. Janet Whitman pressed her face into her husband's shoulder. Benson showed no reaction. The prosecution sought the death penalty. During the penalty phase, impact statements poured from families. Paul Whitman told the court, "My daughter was 16. She never got to graduate, to fall in love, to grow old. He stole every chapter she never got to write." Laura's mother described how she still set a place for her daughter at Thanksgiving. Angela's colleagues spoke of the patients she had saved, the laughter she had shared on long shifts. Daniel Avery, given the chance to address the court, said simply, "I want the world to remember their names, not his." The judge, voice heavy, delivered the sentence: death by lethal injection. "This community waited too long for justice," Judge Franklin said. "The court now gives it a name and a measure." Headlines the next day blared: "Justice after 20 years, Strangler sentenced to death." Outside Mill Creek, the case was studied as a landmark: how DNA could reopen doors long thought sealed, how wrongful convictions demanded constant vigilance. For Mill Creek itself, the verdict did not erase the past. But it gave families a language other than doubt. They could now speak of Laura, Angela, and Claire not as questions but as daughters, sisters, friends, women whose lives had been taken by a man finally named and condemned. Detective Whitaker left the courthouse to applause from strangers, but he walked past them quietly. "It's not about applause," he said later. "It's about a promise kept." The conviction of Mark Benson in 2009 gave Mill Creek something it hadn't known in more than 2 decades: an answer. But answers in cases like these are never clean. They arrive heavy with the weight of years lost, trust broken, and questions that linger long after the gavel falls. The trial ended, but the story of the Mill Creek Strangler continued to ripple outward, through families, through law enforcement, through the justice system, and through the community that had lived in fear and suspicion for so long. For the Bennett, Marino, and Whitman families, the guilty verdict was not closure but a turning point. Laura Bennett's brother, now in his 40s, told the local paper, "I used to dream about what she'd be doing now, if she'd have kids, if she'd be a professor somewhere. That dream will always be unfinished. But at least we don't have to dream about who took her away anymore." His words resonated throughout Mill Creek, grief mingled with gratitude, sorrow bound with a fragile peace. Angela Marino's mother became a quiet but determined advocate for crime victim support groups. She attended State House hearings with a cane in one hand and photographs of her daughter in the other. She reminded lawmakers that victims' families need more than kind words. "We need to make sure no one waits 20 years for the truth," she would say, clutching the same handkerchief she'd carried during the trial. Her testimony, simple and heartfelt, often drew tears even from seasoned politicians. For the Whitmans, the loss of their teenage daughter Claire remained an open wound. Paul Whitman gave up coaching youth baseball, unable to stand the sight of fathers cheering for daughters who reminded him of his own. Janet rarely left town, saying Mill Creek was the only place that still speaks her name. Yet they poured their grief into scholarships at the high school, each one awarded to a senior who dreamed of art or design, just as Claire had. At the annual award ceremony, Janet would stand quietly at the edge of the stage, pressing a ribbon between her fingers, as if to tether herself to her daughter's memory in the most tangible way she could. The families never stopped speaking their daughters' names. They refused to let them be remembered only as victims. They insisted they be remembered as women with ambitions, talents, laughter, and futures stolen. Perhaps no one carried a stranger legacy from the case than Daniel Avery, the man wrongfully imprisoned for Benson's crimes. Exonerated in 2008, Avery spent his first year of freedom stumbling through the modern world. When he had gone in, people used rotary phones and VCRs. When he came out, the world buzzed with cell phones, email, and an internet he barely understood. "When I went in, there were payphones on every corner," he said in one televised interview. "When I came out, there were cell phones that could take pictures and send them across the world in seconds. I had to relearn everything, from how to pay bills to how to talk to people who had lived 20 years without me." He struggled with employment, often rejected when background checks revealed a prison record, even though he had been exonerated. He struggled with trust, flinching at sudden knocks on the door or the sound of raised voices. Relationships too were difficult. "Prison teaches you to build walls," he admitted. "Freedom asks you to tear them down. That's not easy." Yet Avery found purpose. He began speaking at law schools, criminal justice conferences, and innocence projects, telling his story as a cautionary tale. He described the pressure of interrogation rooms, the vulnerability of those with limited education or mental capacity, and the ease with which a false confession could be coerced from someone desperate to make the questioning stop. His voice carried weight. Pennsylvania legislators introduced bills requiring videotaped interrogations in homicide cases. Universities created training modules for police cadets based on Avery's testimony, emphasizing the dangers of tunnel vision and coercive questioning. Avery became an advocate not by choice but by necessity. "I lost 20 years, he told one panel. "I can't get them back. But maybe I can stop the next man from losing his." For law enforcement, the case became both a source of pride and a mark of caution. Detective Cal Whitaker retired in 2012 after more than 3 decades of service. At his farewell, he was praised for his persistence, his refusal to let the Mill Creek murders fade into a file cabinet. Yet Whitaker himself remained haunted. "Justice came," he admitted in an interview, "but not in time for Daniel Avery. That fact never leaves you." The Mill Creek Police Department overhauled its cold case protocols. Evidence rooms were digitized, barcoded, and audited to prevent mishandling. Every detective received training in confirmation bias, a reminder of how easy it was to see what one wanted to see instead of what was truly there. A new cold case unit was formed, staffed with younger detectives mentored by veterans who had lived through the Benson investigation. Chief Harold Dwyer, who had once stood at community forums calming frightened citizens, summed it up. "The Strangler case taught us 2 things: never stop asking questions and never settle for the easiest answer." Nationally, the case became a textbook example of how DNA could rewrite history. In law schools and criminal justice programs, it was cited alongside other high-profile exonerations as proof of both the power and the limitations of forensic evidence. The rise of forensic genealogy, using family DNA databases to identify suspects, was accelerated by cases like Mill Creek. Investigators realized that even when samples sat for decades, science could one day make them speak. Conferences referenced the Benson case as a reminder of why every hair, every fiber, every trace mattered. To mishandle evidence was to silence a voice that might only be heard years later. One forensic scientist at a national symposium put it bluntly, "If you preserve the evidence, time itself becomes an ally. If you don't, you rob the future of answers." By the 2010s, Mill Creek had begun to reclaim its sense of self. The steelworks had long since closed, replaced by small businesses, coffee shops, and art studios in converted warehouses. The town worked to reshape its identity, no longer the place where the Strangler struck, but a community that endured. Yet reminders linger. The old Bennett apartment building was torn down, replaced by student housing. Angela Marino's former home was renovated, painted a cheerful yellow, though neighbors still lower their voices when walking past. The Whitman house remains, the shutters repainted but the lawn kept neat by hands that remember. Every October, on the anniversary of Laura Bennett's death, a candlelight vigil is held by the river. Dozens gather, holding photographs, reciting names, refusing to let the women slip into silence. Local high schoolers write essays about what the case means to them, some choosing to study criminology or law in their memory. A plaque at the high school honors Claire Whitman, and each year the scholarship bearing her name sends another student to college, dreams carried forward in her place. The Mill Creek case left a layered legacy. 4 families, a bittersweet resolution that could never erase grief. For Daniel Avery, a life reclaimed but never fully repaired. For law enforcement, a warning about shortcuts and a call to vigilance. For the justice system, proof that truth may arrive late but must still be pursued. For forensic science, evidence that every trace is worth preserving no matter how small. In classrooms, in training manuals, and legislative hearings, the case is cited as both tragedy and triumph. A story of what happens when fear demands an answer, and of the danger when that answer comes too soon and too easily. History remembers Benson as the Mill Creek Strangler, but the town prefers to remember Laura, Angela, and Claire. Their names are inscribed on a memorial near the high school, 3 plaques beneath a tree planted in 2010. When the wind stirs its branches, the leaves scatter across their names, a reminder that life continues even in the shadow of loss. And yet, the story does not end with them alone. It ends with a community reshaped, a justice system humbled, and a promise that those who were silenced will never be forgotten. It ends with Daniel Avery standing before classrooms, telling young lawyers and officers not just what happened to him, but what could happen again if vigilance is lost. It ends with a town that refuses to let its darkest chapter define it, but insists it be remembered, so that the mistakes and the pain were not in vain. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Thank you for joining us as we preserve these stories one file at a time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so that the memory of these cases lives on.